Hello, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us on the program again. I am Folashade Ogrinde. Now, contrary to expectations, Nigeria's inflation rate declined for the sixth consecutive month to 16.63%, according to the National Bureau of Statistics. This represents 0.38 percentage point decrease compared to 17.01% recorded in August 2021. Also, food inflation, which is a closely watched index, also dropped to 19.57% in September from 20.3% recorded in the month of August. Now, with the exception of core inflation, the consumer price index declined across all annual baskets in September due to base year effects. But with the naira depreciating further against the US dollar, how significant is the inflation decline to the reality of Nigeria's economy? Managing Director and CEO of Kairos Capital Limited, Sam Chidoka, and Bimisola Alunga, Senior Development Analyst at CS Business, joins us now on the program. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Despite the inflation decline being very marginal, do you think to make any difference on the economy, Mr. Chidoka?
No, thanks for having me. In terms of, it depends on how you look at it. For the managers of the economy, it's good. When we had inflation tending upwards for months on month, it didn't seem like a good statistic to come out. But 6 months of inflation going in the right direction, going south. So for the managers of the economy, it's good news. But for the people who are saddled with relieving what inflation means, a 16%, 16.6% inflation rate is still pretty much high for the economy, especially when you look at food inflation, much higher than that. And I think that because you have so many people below the poverty line, that the food inflation is what bites most as far as the economy is concerned. So yes, inflation is coming down. 6 months has been going down. It's good. But to what extent is it affecting the daily living of Nigerians? Not a lot, because you remember again that the inflation calculation is a basket. But what people are mainly focused about is food inflation, and that's heading towards 20%. That's still very high.
Now, what implications do you think this double digits inflation will have on the economy?
The first speaker mentioned, it would definitely have a huge impact on people's pockets. He also mentioned that food inflation is an important aspect that we look at, and that's because food, if we look at the NBS consumption expenditure report from last year, from 2019, we see that food makes up almost half of Nigerians' consumption. So we consume food more than anything else. And if we're looking at food inflation at 20% or at close to 20%, it means that between now and last year, people spend 20% more on food. That's if they're spending or they're trying to buy as much. Usually that's not the impact. So it would definitely reduce people's disposable income. You can't buy as much as you used to buy. And in some cases, people have to resort to some shock responses. And I think from the NBS national survey, we have seen that people's responses to inflation or increase in prices is either that they reduce how much they consume. So people reduce how much they consume, they borrow from friends and family, they sometimes even have to sell their assets to eat, to feed, to exist. And then in some cases, they even go as far as planting their own food themselves. So this is what we're going to expect to see, or what we're already seeing, and we'll see even much more than that.
Now, Mr. Chidoka, I would like to get your perspective on this, and that's about core inflation, which rose by 13.74%. Now, some of the products listed there are majorly imported products. To what extent do you think this might affect inflation rates?
Yeah, so, I mean, when we talk about inflation rate, we focus more on not so much on the core inflation. Yes, that in itself has been trending higher. And yes, you're correct. Based on the report, it's driven mainly by importation. But you know that we are an import-dependent economy. The more we continue to be import-dependent, then you expect this kind of push type inflation to continue to happen in our economy. Unfortunately, we've not been able to come out of that circle of always just not being able to produce what we consume. And you can trace that back to several things. So you don't have power. When you don't have power, your ability to become productive is reduced. We have a lot of insecurity happening, and that's one of the things that is driving food inflation upwards. Because if you go to the food belt of the country from Benue all the way to North Central and you find that there's a lot of cattle rustling, there's a lot of banditry, and farmers can't go to the farm and they can't harvest what they planted. So that invariably has affected pricing of food. So that also drives inflation upwards, and that helps us. That makes it more difficult for us to be productive as a nation. So the earlier we deal with power issues, the earlier we deal with banditry and all kinds of insurgency that is happening in the country, the earlier we deal with multiple taxation and just general harassment. I like to call it harassment from government entities. I was reading a report from a manufacturing concern, and the company wrote that they had 42 agencies, from local government to state government to federal government. They deal with 42 agencies just to be able to get their goods from their factory to the farm gate. Now, you cannot be productive in such an economy. And so because of that, we rely so much on importation. We have to deal with the niggling issues surrounding our economy so that we can reduce inflation, importation, and thereby reduce what we see happening to our core inflation from importation.
Now, of course, you spoke about some of the key drivers of inflation and their forward movement implications on the economy. But I'd like us to focus a bit on core inflation, which is, of course, the inflation away from agriculture and some other aspects. Now, Ms. Alonge, I'd like to get your perspective on this. For the core inflation, some of the products listed there were actually, items that are majorly imported into Nigeria. And we know that we have scarce forex. How do you think, or to what extent do you think this has affected Nigeria's inflation rate?
We need to think about, if you're importing anything, apart from getting forex, apart from the exchange rate, there are many other cost centers or things that would include, that would add to your cost. So you're thinking about the transportation from the port, you're thinking about transportation to the port, you're thinking about different tariffs and different custom duties that you need to pay as a result of the importation. So those things add up to the cost. And then apart from that, obviously you have mentioned foreign exchange. It's one thing to get the foreign exchange at certain rates. It's another thing to get it it's another thing for it to even be available. So, we know of the CBN's items, the CBN's list of items that have been restricted from accessing forex for importation. So whoever is importing things like rice would need to get their foreign exchange from the parallel market. And obviously that rate is much, much higher than people importing it directly, that people importing legal or items that they can get official foreign exchange for. You also have a situation where people even importing and people eligible for tax holidays. So, for instance, if you're importing agricultural machinery, you're entitled to tax holidays. You're supposed to bring it in duty-free, right? But then we still have a situation where different companies have complained of still having to pay duties, even regardless of the law that said that they're allowed to bring it in for free. So people still having to pay duties when they have planned not to. All that just adds up to the cost of operating these businesses, and obviously they would then add this cost to their revenue. So exchange rate definitely has an impact. Access to the foreign exchange as well. It's one thing for you to hear that the exchange rate is a certain rate. It's another thing for you to actually be able to get it in. If you're not able to get foreign exchange, then you're not able to import. Then what you have available, you're going to have to increase your cost so that you can make enough revenue that would help you get more of these items. So I think all of that. But then obviously the core inflation is just all items less food and energy. So we still have things like communications, we still have transportation, we still have health and all those other things that still make up core inflation apart from items that we import. So those two would require some attention.
Now, Ms. Alonge, you made a very valid point with regards to policy on taxation. And if we can all recall that at the 2022 budget presentation by the president, it made mention that Nigeria would drive up revenue by more taxation. Now, Mr. Chidoka, do you think this will, of course, on the other hand, we know that this would help drive up revenue, but in the long run, do you think this would not have, a side effect for the economy?
So, well, it depends on what you mean by the long run, because when you're planning for an economy that has double-digit inflation, an economy that is not productive at this point, economy that exchange rates is ballooning, you don't think so much about long term, but you actually try and stem the tide of what is happening at the moment. So when government says they are going to tax people, but the question you have to ask is, you can't pay taxes if you haven't made money. If we believe the figure that we have over 100 million Nigerians that are below the poverty line, that means you already have 100 million Nigerians that cannot pay tax because they are not just making enough money. And remember that recently we had a review of the tax laws that included that companies that make, I think it's 25 million and less, are not susceptible to company income tax. And so you need the economy to be productive. You need people to be making money before you can talk about taxation. So it's a nice talk in terms of saying we'll tax more to get more revenue. But in terms of do people have the capacity to pay the tax? That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is the fact that even those that have the capacity to pay the tax, we've not done enough to drag more people into the tax net. And I think that that's the work that the responsible agencies, maybe FIRS, has to do even more and continue to drag more people into the tax net. But I think that in growing our revenue, taxation perhaps is not the only way. There are perhaps other ways in growing revenue. One of the ways the government can look at is also reduction in expense. I mean, we're a country that is our economy is struggling at this point. There are so many things that we spend money financing lifestyle, and you ask yourself, do we need to do all that? And so by the time we begin to balance our books and reduce unnecessary expenses, become a productive economy and start to export. I read a publication that says that planes that come into Nigeria, cargo planes, actually go back empty. That can't happen, and you expect people to pay taxes or you expect to make more government revenue.
Well, you made a very valid point there, Mr. Chidoka, but it's been a good first half conversation, but we'll take a break here, and when we return, we'll shift our focus to other indexes. To stay with us.
Corruption not in my country.
Hello? Yeah, I found your wallet in front of a supermarket. Meet me at Apple Junction. Yes, I'll be waiting for you.
Now we find out. Two of us.
Thank you very much, officer. You know, it's surprising that men like you still exist in the police force.
Yes, so...
Oh, yes.
This is just a token of my appreciation.
Oh, no, you don't need to do this. We are only doing our job.
Thank you very much. God bless you.
You're welcome.
Now I know police is really my friend.
Yes.
Friend. Hey. Which came out with this one? I don't understand.
You know your problem. You are greedy. I'm a policeman who is doing his job. All forms of corruption in the force. Not in my country.
Corruption not in my country.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us, I've been discussing Nigeria's declining inflation rates and the impact of double-digit inflation on the economy. Well, my guests have been the Managing Director and the CEO of Kairos Capital Limited, Mr. Sam Chidoka, and Gbemisola Alonge, Senior Development Analyst at Steers Business. Well, thank you so much for standing by. Now, going with Mrs. Alonge, food inflation also dropped to 19.57% in September from 20.3% recorded in the prior month. But when compared to the previous year, food index saw an increase. Now, how significant is this outcome for the average Nigerian?
Not very significant, and that's for different reasons. First is this food inflation is partly as a result of seasonal changes. So we're slowly moving to the dry season, and that means that all the crops that farmers have been planting ever since June or July, when the rainy season began, or whenever they started planting, they would start to harvest. But if you notice from the past, from the trend in like the past 3 or 4 years, around this time, food inflation actually increases, and that's because we're approaching the festive season. The end of the year festivities would definitely drive demand for food up, and when demand for food increases, obviously price increases as well. So that is most likely what's going to happen. And I mean, that just means that if there is even a slight increase, and I mean, inflation means the rate at which the price is increasing. So even when we see a decline, it doesn't mean that prices are not increasing. It just means that the rate of the increase has declined. So it still means that food prices are still increasing, but maybe not as much as it was in August. But then because we're approaching the festive season, we expect to see that food inflation increase again. I mean, I personally expect to see that increase again because there has been no significant change or policy to curb the insecurity and just the major issues around food production. So, I mean, I don't think personally individuals will feel it. I don't think households will feel it, feel the reduction in the inflation that is. And I think it will even increase further before the year runs out.
Now let's talk about some of the issues you've raised, because there's no way we can talk about a good economy without talking about some basic things like security, infrastructural development and whatnot. Now, looking forward, this is we are almost rounding off 2021. For 2022, Mr. Chiduko, are you seeing a progression in terms of economic development, especially in the areas of curbing insecurity and improving infrastructural development?
Well, so in terms of insecurity, I do not see much of improvement, but it depends on where you're looking at it from. If you look at it from perhaps when we were at a stage where things were really bad, maybe you can say the cup is half full or you can say the cup is empty, depending on how you look at it. But I think that there's still a lot of work to be done in insecurity. At a point in this country, we knew that the Northeast was where there were issues around banditry, around terrorism and all of that. But over time, in the last few years, it's spread across the country. So from if you go to the middle belt, even to the southeast, even the south is not excluded from all this cattle rustling, destruction of farmlands by animals, and all forms of farmer-herder conflict that has affected productivity in terms of agriculture. In terms of infrastructure, you can say that we are seeing some improvement. Part of the thing that I would really like to see is improvement in power. I think that a lot has been done in the place of, you can argue, train infrastructure, maybe road infrastructure, some bridge infrastructure. The second Niger bridge is almost here with us. But we need to see more in terms of power to solve that conundrum that makes it difficult for us to have steady power, because that's what the manufacturing base of the country needs. If we have power, then we can become a lot more productive. So going forward, I'd like to see improvement in security and improvement in power, especially. If that infrastructure, power, and security is in place, I think we'll be better off as a nation.
Well, finally, government has expressed optimism that inflationary pressure could decline in 2022 to as low as 13%. How realistic do you think this projection is really?
Not realistic at all. And that's because there's no significant impact. So on the monetary side, obviously we know that inflation is driven by food inflation. So monetary policy cannot curb a fiscal situation. So and I mean, there hasn't been any change in monetary policy in like the last all year. We haven't seen any significant change. Apart from that, the fiscal side, we're not seeing anyone do anything significant. So in the farming communities, the security situation has not changed. we haven't seen no one has opened the borders to allow importation of food to increase the supply. Obviously, knowing the government currently, knowing the current administration, we don't expect that to happen. So I don't see how. I saw 13% and I was shocked. I don't understand. I don't see it. I don't see how there would be a significant change, and that's because unlike 2016 2016/17 when we rolled out of a recession and we're trying to heal, the situation then was mostly driven by the exchange rate. In this case, food inflation, the situation isn't driven by the exchange rate, it's driven by situations happening in the country. And until there is a significant change in those security issues and the issue with even the way the farmers currently plant and cultivate their crops, nothing is going to change. Maybe it would increase, maybe it would reduce rather. But
Ms. Alonge, are we going to see a slight decline, even in the littlest form? Are we going to see a very small decline, even if it's not up to 13%?
Yes, we'll see a decline, and that's because, by the time like I said, right now, the situation we're facing is a seasonal situation. The decline is because, after the rainy season, there's a huge glut in the market, like farmers bringing their crops and then there's high supply. We will continue to see that towards the end of the year. And by next year, although there will be the seasonal end of the year increase in prices, by next year, we expect it to, still be there'll be a decrease. But 13% right now, in 16%, and 16 to 13% might seem like, just 3%, but it's very unlikely that it would decline significantly, except there's a huge push on the fiscal side. That's like in terms of the government, steering the economy. But if we don't see that, I don't see 13%. I just don't see it.
Well, we can only keep our fingers crossed and hope for the very best. Well, Manager Director and CEO of Kairos Capital Limited, Sam Chidoka, Gbemisola Alonge, Senior Development Analyst at Shares Business. So thank you so much for your contributions on the program.
Thanks for having me.
I need to wrap on the program. Thank you so much for watching. I am Folashade Ogrinde. Bye for now and see you next week.